So ultimately, periodization is simply a means of organizing the planning of a training intervention so that the program is partitioned into specific time periods. Now, the multi-year training structure, typically 2 to 4 years in duration, is subdivided into more detailed individual annual training plans that are developed based upon the athlete's progression through the various stages or benchmarks associated with a multi-year training plan. So the annual training plan really sets the general pathway for a training year, while the other cycles set the means, methods, and modes that are used to get to the primary competitive targets. So if we're talking about sports with only one competitive season, then the annual training plan would be represented as a macro cycle that you see here. But in many sports, they may have more than one competitive season. Therefore, the macro cycle or the annual training plan may consist of multiple macro cycles, with each macro cycle perhaps lasting several months in duration. Within each macro cycle are smaller cycles called mesocycles that typically last several weeks to months. The most common duration of a mesocycle is 2 to 6 weeks in duration. And then each mesocycle is further divided into individual microcycles, which may last several days to perhaps 2 weeks in duration. However, if we're talking about undulating or daily undulating periodization, then a microcycle may be one training bout. And at least in this table, those microcycles can be further divided into training days, again representing 1 day of training, that can be further divided into training sessions if, for example, the athlete is performing multiple sessions of exercise per day. So periodized training plans systematically shift training foci from general non-specific activities of high volume and low intensity toward activities of lower volume and higher intensities over a period of many weeks or months. And this is done to help reduce the potential for overtraining while optimizing performance capacities. So this would be an example here of the annual training cycle broken down into one macro cycle. And in this case, that would be 12 weeks of training. And we're referring here to the pre-competition period or the preseason part of the overall training year. The macrocycle can be further broken down into smaller mesocycles, with each mesocycle in this example consisting of 4 weeks of training, and then each mesocycle broken down into smaller cycles known as microcycles, which in this case, each microcycle being 1 week of training. So with linear periodization, this often contains 4 distinct but interrelated training phases, known as the preparatory, first transition, competition, and second transition period. And you see those highlighted down here in the bottom. Now this model is often applied for novice athletes with a lower training status, and it is important to note that the volume and intensity progressions are in fact non-linear, shown up here, because of the fluctuations in the loadings that occur at the micro and mesocycle levels. Now, we know that advanced athletes require greater training variation as well as higher volumes and intensities in order to allow them to continue to experience appropriate training stimuli. Therefore, the shift from higher volume to higher intensity training can occur earlier in the preparatory phase with higher overall training volumes as compared to those that you see in this figure here. So again, this would be an example of classic or linear periodization model with the athlete starting at a higher volume of training at a lower intensity, and then over time as they move from one phase to the next, we have a trade-off here with a gradual increase in intensity and a gradual reduction in volume of training, with the intent that the athlete is peaking at their most important time, so that would be during their competitive season. In outlining a periodized training plan, the starting point is usually the preparation phase. Now, this initial period is usually the longest and occurs during the time of the year when there are no competitions and technical, tactical, as well as sport-specific work is limited. Therefore, this is typically done during the athlete's off-season. Now, the major emphasis of this phase is establishing a base level of conditioning to increase the athlete's tolerance for more intense training to come. The conditioning activities will begin with relatively low intensities and high volumes, such as a high repetition resistance training with light to moderate resistance. Now, during the preparation phase, resistance training phases can be created in order to depict more refined differences in training intensity and volume. In order, these are the hypertrophy, strength endurance, and basic strength phases. Now, the hypertrophy strength endurance phase, also known as the general preparation phase, this generally occurs during the early portion of the preparation phase. During this phase, the training intensity is low, so this may be around 50 to 75% of 1 RM, and the overall volume is high. So, for example, the athlete may be performing 3 to 6 sets of 8 to 20 reps per set of given exercises. Now, the primary goals during this training phase are to increase lean body mass, to develop an endurance base, or to do both. This development will serve as the foundation for the higher intensity training in subsequent phases. Now, with strength or power athletes, the primary target might be to stimulate hypertrophic effects while increasing strength endurance. However, with endurance or aerobic athletes, the primary goal might be to increase strength endurance without significantly increasing hypertrophy. Now, in the later portion of the preparation phase, the primary aim of the basic strength phase is to increase the strength of the muscles that are essential in the primary sport movements. So here we see in the later portion of the preparation phase, the basic strength phase, characterized by a higher intensity and moderate to high volume. Now, the basic strength phase becomes more specific to the sport and involves heavier loads, so let's say 80 to 95% of one's 1 RM performed at lower volumes. So, for example, 2 to 6 sets and 2 to 6 reps per set of given exercises. So in the case of the sport-specific activities that may be included in the basic strength phase, this may include interval sprints for aerobic athletes, more intense plyometric exercises if those are included in the athlete's training plan, but also including the addition of sport-specific resistance exercises, again mimicking the movements associated with the athlete's sport or event. Now, the first transition phase. This phase serves as a link between the preparation and competition phases, and the central aim of this phase is to shift training focus towards the elevation of strength and its translation into power development. In order to maximize this process and facilitate recovery, there are variations in training intensity and workload at the microcycle level. Additionally, the last week of the period is marked by reduced training volume, intensity, or both in order to achieve recovery before the beginning of the competition phase. So we see here this first transition phase here occurring during the athlete's preseason typically. So a specific phase within this period is known as the strength power phase, which is characterized by low to very high intensity. And again, that range is going to depend, or that high intensity is going to depend based upon the exercise performed. So for the non-power core exercises such as squats and presses, it's going to be a high intensity or heavy load. And for the power exercises, it's going to range anywhere from about 30 to 85% of one's 1 RM, given the specific goals of the athlete and the specific exercise being performed. And overall, the higher intensity, the lower the volume. So now performing the exercises for fewer sets and fewer reps per set. So in terms of this strength power phase, as I mentioned, it addresses both strength and power development using a mixed training approach in which heavy and low load training, again ranging from 30 to 95% of one's 1RM, again depending on the exercise, and also includes low volumes, is used to optimize both attributes, both strength and power development.